So good morning, everybody. My name's Andrew Kingston. I'm a research fellow here at Newcastle University. First of all, I'd just like to thank Charlie for his sterling organisation of this workshop. It's such a pleasure to see so many people here. And introduce myself. So as I've said, I'm a research fellow here at Newcastle. Have a bit of a strange background to say that I work in ageing. My undergraduate degree was in maths. And then I did a degree in statistics and then began to work with some very eminent researchers at Newcastle University's Institute for Ageing, Professor Tom Kirkwood and Carol Jagger, and became very interested in how I could use my skills in terms of statistics and mathematics to map the health pathways of older people and to expose differences in health trajectories and what the drivers are behind those health trajectories. And that kind of underlies the presentation that I'm going to give today. I'm going to give an overview of some of the results from some of the studies that I've worked on, where inequalities may lie, particularly in relation to gender, to socioeconomic status, and healthy life expectancy. And then talk a little bit about my program of research to understand how we might go about understanding how the various factors that Professor Scharf spoke about, how they interact across the life course to reshape trajectories of aging in older people so that everybody can live longer, more independently in the community. But first of all, I think what I'd like to point out is that when you speak to the average person on the street, and I'm not talking about the people in this room here, but I'm just talking about particularly my family, and ask them, when does aging start? They'll say, oh, well, you know, when you retire. And actually, if you asked me when I was 7 years old or 8 years old, at what age does somebody become old? I would have said, oh, around about 40. And I'm actually 40 now. And incidentally, this picture here, this one here, this is me when I was around 7 or 8. And this is me when I was 40. And I don't think the health trajectory is too bad at the moment. But this picture here, from the second from the left, is a picture of my grandfather, whose health isn't particularly great and has been in decline for quite some time. His exposures across the life course leave something to be desired. He started smoking when he was about 8. He's drank heavily most of his life. He's worked very hard right up until retirement, in fact worked beyond retirement, and now lives his life in quite a disabled state. And he's relatively young, speaking in terms of aging terms. Contrary to my grandfather, my great-grandmother lived a completely different life. She lived right until she was 95, cognitively intact, physically able, and then she became sick quite close to the end of her life, and so remained very active, very engaged, socially connected. Then disease and disability took her out pretty quickly. So even within one family, you can see that there are different trajectories of health. And so genetics isn't the key player in aging trajectories of older people. And in fact, it's estimated that only 20% of aging trajectories can be explained through genetics. And exposures right across the life course are the primary driver of how people age in older life and across life. And these are related to genes, which I've just mentioned: nutrition, lifestyle, environment, socioeconomic status, attitude, and mental health. And there are a number of studies across the UK at the moment that are looking at ways to understand those factors and their interactions and how they shape health trajectories. Right here in Newcastle, we have our flagship study, the 85+ study, which looked at the health of those people who were 85 and older in Newcastle and North Tyneside. We have the Cognitive Function in Aging study, which is a study based in England and Wales, which had a particular focus on cognition, but also gathered lots of other data around different mechanisms and factors that are determinants of health in later life. And then, of course, we have the English Longitudinal Study of Aging, which has been going for some time now, of around 11,000 people, which also looks at the factors and their interactions and follows the same individuals through time to see how their health changes. But what I'd like to do first of all is just share some results from the Newcastle 85+ study, because this is actually the study that I conducted my PhD on, and it's the one where I really began to become engaged with trajectories of health in older people. So this is the Newcastle 85 Plus study. It began in 2006 and it approached everybody in Newcastle and North Tyneside who turned 85 in 2006 and were therefore born in 1921 to find out if they'd like to be part of the study. We recruited just over 1,000 people and we followed those people for just over 10 years now, and we have data at 5 different time points. Some of those people have died over time. I think at the last interview point at 10 years, we interviewed 91, which went down, and at our first interview point, we had 852. So you can see quite a few people have died, but between 85 and 95, it's probably what you would expect and in line with the national projections. So at baseline, so this was at aged 85, we looked at the number of diseases that these people had and just done a count of these diseases. So these were in relation to arthritis, to respiratory disease, to cardiac disease, to depression, and just done a general count of the number of diseases. And you can see here that the average number of diseases that both men and women had were around about 4. But despite the fact that these people had some quite complex diseases and were managing these together with other diseases, when we asked these older people, how do you rate your health compared to people the same age, they rated it fairly well. And you can see that 78% rated their health compared to others the same age as good, very good, or excellent, which is maybe surprising given that people were dealing with at least 4 diseases. But this could be a cohort effect that Professor Scharf's spoken about earlier. These are a unique cohort of people who were born just after the First World War, grew up during the Depression, then often the men often went off to fight in the Second World War while the women stayed home and had to hold fort here. So there could be a cohort effect here in terms of how they view their health, and that may not be reflected in younger cohorts. We don't know that, but it could be true. So that was a number of diseases, but what you can notice here is that as you move up through the number of diseases, you can see that women tend to have more diseases than men. So you can see here 16.7% of women have 6 diseases compared to only 11.3% of men, 9.67, 7.9. So as you move up, the pattern shifts over from men having fewer diseases to women having more diseases. So there's an inequality there in terms of the disease that women are suffering in later life. Surprisingly, what you find is despite the fact that women have a greater number of diseases and also have more disability, women tend to still live longer at older age. So men have less disease, less disability, but die younger. Women have more disease, more disability, and just seem to hang on. So there's something special about women. That means they're much stronger than us men. So when we speak about disability here, so this is a count again, This is a count again of the number of items that people have difficulty with that they do every day. So that's things like bathing, ambulation, toileting, cooking and cleaning, and we just sum across those items. And you can see that 1/4 of men, but 1/6 of women have no important functional limitation at 85. An interesting finding, I think, even in itself, despite the fact that there was nobody with no disease. And then when you break those down, so this was what the prevalence looked like. So this is a proportion of people who have the disabilities at aged 85. So 65.6% of women have those disabilities, of men and women have disability at aged 85. And you can follow the percentages down. I think I may need to swap here to play it. And we can follow those through time. And you can see that as you move up through the ages, the prevalence of difficulties with none of those disabilities actually goes down. So people are getting more disabled with time. And what you find is that when you look at the difference between men and women, women are becoming more disabled than men again. And that may be a function of the fact that the men have just decided to give up and die, as I've already spoken about. So that was the pattern for men and women. And then you could look at frailty. So frailty is a measure that's used by the clinical community, and it represents a vulnerability of people to be susceptible to disease and their capacity to bounce back from that disease as well. And you can see that people are categorized in this case into three possible domains. They're either robust, meaning they have no frailty, they are either pre-frail or they're frail. And you can see here again that there is more frailty in women than there is in men. Even as you move through the baseline, 18 months, 36 months, and at age 90. We actually have these data at age 95 as well, and the pattern persists. So men, even at age 90, there are still more men who are robust proportionally compared to women. So there's another interesting factor. So there's this huge male disability survival paradox thing going on, and we still really don't know what drives that. There are a number of theories around biology, around how women may present to GPs, around the fact that women give birth to children and it modifies lipid levels and it may have protective effects in terms of their mortality at later ages. We don't know. But it could also be a function of socioeconomic status or various things. So what I'd like to do now is just look at each of those metrics in terms of socioeconomic status. So there's two measures of socioeconomic status here. We have the years of formal education, which is the measure of economic status in when people are young. And then you have the measure of socioeconomic status called the English Index of Multiple Deprivation. And I'll just say a little bit more about that before I go on, in case anybody's not sure what that is. So everybody who lives in the UK has an index of multiple deprivation, and that is based upon the postcode where you live. And that's calculated by the income of the area, the employment figures, the education level of that area, the health, the crime, barriers to housing, and the living environment. The lower that score, the more deprived relatively your area is deemed to be. The higher that score, the more affluent your area is deemed to be. Now, if we look at the frailty in terms of deprivation, you can see that poorer people, or people who come from the lower, so this is aged 85, there are fewer people robust, and as you move through the deprivation index, there is a clear dose response in terms of the level of robustness, or the proportion of people who live in that area who remain robust. So there's a clear socioeconomic gradient there across the frailty and the deprivation index. And that also persists for education as well. If you just ignore this little artifact of the data that tends to be a rise, people who have high school or around high school education, the proportion so this is years of education across the bottom here, the proportion who remain who are frail remains pretty static until you get to more than high school education, and then you can see that the proportion begins to fall off. And again, that's a dose response. So the more education you have, the suggestion is you are to be less frail. Now, is that a function of if I have more education, that may be that I have a more affluent job during my lifetime? Am I more likely to absorb health messages? Is my health literacy greater? It's multiple factors that play into that. But this is the kind of evidence I think that Professor Sharp's spoken about. Time and time again, this is being thrown up across different socioeconomic gradients. So that's kind of where things stand for the very old in Newcastle, and that pattern persists in whichever data set you look at, whether it's the English Longitudinal Study of Aging or the Cognitive Function and Aging Study, and actually persists around the world as well. So then we began to think, well, what does the future hold? And this was some work that we'd done quite recently, a colleague and myself, where we took 3 longitudinal studies of aging, the Understanding Society, ELSA, and the Cognitive Function and Aging Study, and said, well, we know what the prevalence of disease looks like now. We have follow-up data, so we know how that's beginning to change. Can we forecast right into the future from between now and 2041 to see what the prevalence of disease is going to look like? So essentially what we take is real people with real data, and we artificially age these people through time. And I'm just wondering if that works. No, it doesn't. And this is what happens. And the picture is not great. So these are the prevalence of diseases or impairments, and you can see that as you move through the years, everything is going up, particularly arthritis and hypertension. Relatively, the greatest increases are seen for diabetes and stroke, which is not good for our aging populations because things are going to get quite bad, especially in terms of multimorbidity, the number of concurrent diseases that people might have. And then you can also think about this in terms of dependency. So earlier when I spoke about disability in terms of the individual activities that people do, we speak about dependency. So this is one of the things that really resonates with me because this, when I grow older and I begin to lose capacity with my daily activities, the thing that I'm afraid of most is losing my independence. I don't want somebody to come in and have to care for me. I want to be able to care for me for as long as possible, right up until very close to death at least. And I think that's what a lot of people want. If you put dementia to one side and ask people what are they afraid of when they get older, the Disability Living Foundation found that actually it was the loss of independence beyond even death. And so what we done was we looked at the interval of need. So this represents how often somebody may need help or somebody to come into their home and help them do things that they do, that they've taken for granted and do everything throughout their life themselves. So high dependency are those people who essentially require 24-hour care. So those people are people who need to go into a care home. And then medium dependency are people who require help at regular times throughout the day. Low dependency requires help less than daily. And then there are people who are independent. And using that same model of artificially aging people, the forecasts show that actually for people aged 75 to 84, the news is pretty good. At 75 to 84, 284,000 people needed 24-hour care. But by 2035, it's only going to be 241,000. So in that age group, it's pretty good. But what's not good is if you look at the people who are aged 85 and over, that's going to more than double between now and 2035. Now, that has huge implications in terms of social care, but it also has huge implications in terms of what people want. I'm going to skip through the next slides because it's essentially another message of it's not great for men, it's great for women. I'm going to share these slides, but I've just been given me 1 minute warning and I just wanted to mention something else about you. So the other thing that in terms of measuring health is essentially a bad trajectory of health. So this is your measure of health down the side here, and you have increasing age. This trajectory here is very suboptimal because by about 65% of the way through your life, you've lost 50% of your health. And essentially, this trajectory would be my grandfather. What you really want is this trajectory, where you go along very nicely, and then towards the end of life, something takes you out pretty quickly, essentially. And the goal is to move from here to here. And these trajectories already exist in these data sets. Some people are following this top trajectory, but it tends to be people from higher socioeconomic groups. And the suboptimal trajectory tends to be those people from lower socioeconomic groups. So there you see the social gradient again. This is some of my work that I'm doing at the moment. What a lot of people don't know is what to put on this axis. People measure health. What is health? How should we measure it? I say you should measure it through these daily activities. These daily activities, you encounter them in a particular order. They unfold in an order. So why not put them on an axis and say, well, the first thing I know I'm going to have difficulty with is cutting toenails, then it's shopping, then it's cutting steps. Here's your suboptimal trajectory that I mentioned. Here's your optimal trajectory. How can we understand how these factors here on the right can reshape this curve to that curve? And how do inequalities in aging impact those different trajectories? And essentially, this is why I would like to do this, because I think by delaying disability and delaying dependency, you can look at socioeconomics, you can look at frailty, you can look at multimorbidity, and they all interact across that pathway. And by delaying disability, essentially, we'll spend a longer time living and a shorter time dying. Incidentally, this is my great-grandmother here. I don't know this dude, but I do know he's a poster boy for healthy aging. It's Robert Marchand. He's a 105-year-old Frenchman who's recently set a world record for cycling 15 kilometers in under 1 hour. 105? Some acknowledgements, and that's me. I'm sorry, I would have liked to spoken a bit more, but I'm out of time.